1 Samuel chapter 14. Introduction. In this chapter, we have the following. 1. Jonathan smites the Philistines, verses 1 to 15. 2. The defeat of the Philistines, verses 16 to 23. 3. Saul forbids the people to eat nothing till evening, verses 24 to 35. 4. Jonathan was pointed out by Lot for eating honey, verses 36 to 46. 5. Saul's exploits and his family, verse 47 to 52. This chapter starts with Jonathan, the son of Saul, who led his armor bearer to spy against the Philistine army while encouraging himself in the Lord his God. He did this without his father's knowledge. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron with 600 men and a priest Ahijah. Jonathan fought with such rage and fury, and perhaps with an overabundance of faith, that the Philistines turned one against the other, and thus he defeated them. Meanwhile, back at the camp, Saul mustered his forces and found that Jonathan and his armor bearer were not present. While the battle continued and the Philistines were being destroyed, Saul called a fast. Jonathan didn't know about the fast and ate some honey, which gave him energy to fight. When the Philistines were defeated, the people seized the spoil and began to eat flesh without bleeding the animals. Saul builds an altar there and inquires of the Lord if he may pursue the Philistines by night, but receives no answer. Saul attributes this to some sin committed by some unknown person and makes an inquiry by Lot. He finds that Jonathan had tasted the honey, on which he purposes to put him to death because of the vow. But the people interpose and rescue Jonathan, as he was the very reason they won the Philistines. The chapter ends with stating Saul's victories and his family. Let us see 7 wonderful characters of the mighty warrior Jonathan, son of Saul, which made him win the battle with the Philistines. Verses 1 to 15, 20 to 23. 1. Jonathan took an initiative. Verse 1. Jonathan stepped out in faith to the Philistine outpost on the other side and convinced his armor bearer to do the same. In the first strike alone, they slaughtered 20 Philistines in an area of about half an acre. Verse 14. It happened one day. There was nothing in this day to indicate it would be remarkable. But on this day, God helped Israel win a great victory through the bold trust of Jonathan. The Israelites were in military conflict. Chapter 13, verse 19 to 21, where victory seemed impossible. They were vastly outnumbered and greatly surpassed in military technology. Yet, Jonathan was bold enough to go over to the Philistine garrison with his armor bearer just to see what the Lord might do. Jonathan deliberately did not tell his father because he believed his father would have simply said no. This action of Jonathan was totally contrary to the laws of war. No military operations should be undertaken without the knowledge and command of the general. But it is likely that he was led to do this by a divine influence. 2. Jonathan had a loyal helper. Verse 1, verse 6 and verse 7. Loyalty is the greatest asset of any leader, both in times of crisis and in times of prosperity. The armor bearer's words recorded in 1 Samuel 14, 6, 7, where he said, "Go ahead, I am with your heart and soul," shows the extent of his loyalty. These words must have cheered Jonathan greatly. Armor bearers in ancient times had to be unusually brave and loyal, since the lives of their masters depended on them. The function of Jonathan's armor bearer was especially important because of the scarcity of weapons in Israel. 3. Jonathan did not seek vainglory. Verse 3. No one was aware that Jonathan left. This indicates that Jonathan did not go over to the Philistine garrison out of the desire for personal glory. If that was his motive, he would have told at least a few people that he went. 4. Jonathan finds a good strategic position. Verses 4-5. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez and the other Sena. One cliff stood to the north toward Michmash, the other to the south toward Gibeah. On his way to the Philistine garrison, Jonathan saw this strategic position, a narrow path through a large pass with large, sharp rocks on either side. A few men could easily fight against a much larger number at this strategic place. If Jonathan never decided, "Come, let us go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side," 1 Samuel 14:1, he would have never found the strategic place. Bozez means shining, Sena means slippery. This adventurous expedition is one of the most gallant that history records. This action was rash and contrary to all established rules of military discipline, which did not permit soldiers to fight or to undertake any enterprise that may involve important consequences without the order of generals. Amidst all these rules, God guided Jonathan as he boldly trusted God and acted on that bold trust. 5. Jonathan remembered his identity and makes a bold proposal. Verses 6-7. Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." Jonathan was different. He remembered that he indeed is an individual from God's chosen nation. He believed that God will fight for him. He wanted to see what God might do through two men who trusted him and stepped out boldly. Jonathan knew the need was great, since Israel was hopeless and demoralized. Something had to be done, and Jonathan was willing to let God use him. Jonathan had a Romans 8:31 heart. If God be for us, who can be against us? Jonathan had little faith in himself, but great faith in God. 6. Jonathan led with sound discernment. Verses 8-10. A leader is God's chosen channel for providing direction. Without God, the leader cannot do anything, and without the leader, God shall not. It's Jonathan that understood the sign and its sequel. He instructed the armor bearer about what to do and when. Leaders are responsible for making sound decisions and guiding the followers even in times of crisis. Jonathan proposes a test. Jonathan said, "Come on then. We will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be the sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." Jonathan had no doubt asked this as a sign from God, exactly as Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, did in Genesis 24:12. In a step of faith, Jonathan wanted to know if God was really leading. He proposed a test based on the response of the Philistine guards. In Gideon's test in setting of a fleece, Judges 6:36-40, Gideon had a confirmed word of God to guide him, and he doubted God's word. Here, Jonathan had no word from God. He was prompted by faith. Significantly, he did not demand to know the whole battle plan from God in advance. He was willing to take it one step at a time and let God plan it out. This is faith. 7. God honors his trust in him. Verses 11 to 15, 20 to 23. The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer, "Come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson." Come up to us! Wow! At this exciting moment, God confirmed Jonathan's bold trust with this sign, and he knew God would do something great. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed 20 men in an area of about half an acre. The spectacle of 20 corpses would suggest to others that they were attacked by a numerous force. Half an acre of land, according to the ancients, is a quantum of land which a yoke of oxen could plow in a day. The success of the adventure was aided by a panic that struck the enemy, produced both by a sudden surprise and a shock of an earthquake. They were under a divine confusion, and they rushed about, thinking their fellow Philistines might be the enemy, and began to fight and kill one another. Look how the Lord would use the swords and spears of the Philistines as instruments of their own destruction. God used the Philistines themselves to make the Israelites win. It all started with one man who dared to take an initiative. There are 4 wonderful applications we can draw from this passage as leaders of God's people today. 1. The leader must be a man of initiative. 2. The leader must earn loyalty. 3. The leader must exercise sound discernment. 4. The leader can't forget his identity in Christ. Folly of Saul, verses 2:16 to 48. Let's see the 7 mistakes Saul did as a king. 1. Saul did not realize that he was in the front line and everyone was watching him. Verse 2-3. The king was simply sitting under a pomegranate tree in Migron with 600 men and a priest Ahijah, while his son boldly went over to the Philistine garrison. Migron is also called Rimmon, which is in the strong rock in which 600 Benjamites took shelter in Judges 20:45. Saul's royal glory is almost gone, and it is appropriate that he associates himself with Ahijah, a relative of the man Ichabod, named "The glory has departed." 1 Samuel 4:22. Ahijah is also called Ahimelech. 1 Samuel 22:9. Had King Saul remembered his identity in God, he would have marched forward and attacked the army instead of sitting back with 600 warriors, wasting time. 2. Saul did not watch the moment and so missed the moment to act as a king. Verses 16 to 23. When it was time to act as a king, Saul musters the force to see who has left them. This was useless at this moment. Saul should have gone to fight the Philistines at this strategic moment. Saul then began to inquire of God. Though Samuel was near him in Gibeah of Benjamin, chapter 13 verse 15, he called for the ark, desiring to know whether it would be safe for him to attack the Philistines. This was useless at this moment. There's a time to go aside and pray, and there's a time to get your sword out and fight. Saul didn't know what time that was. Eventually, the noise of God and Jonathan fighting against the Philistines became so loud that Saul knew he also had to fight. So he told the priest, "Withdraw your hand." This meant stop seeking an answer from God. Saul had to inquire whether God would give him leave to do anything. But he was in such haste to fight a fallen enemy that he would not stay to end his devotions, nor hear what answer God would give him. 3. Saul made a foolish decision. Verses 24 to 30. On this day of battle against the Philistines, Saul declares a curse. "Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the troops tasted food. This shows that Saul's focus was wrong. Saul put the army of Israel under an oath so he could take vengeance on his enemies. If he regarded it as his battle, he should simply fast. Saul showed that even in doing something spiritual like fasting, his focus is on himself, not on the Lord. It also shows that Saul's sense of authority was wrong. He did not have the authority to proclaim such a curse as he was not a spiritual leader of the nation. If such a fast was to be declared and a curse attached to it, Samuel had the authority to do it, not Saul. When the moral and the physical energy of Israel should have been the strongest, the army was made weak through fasting. There's nothing wrong with fasting itself, but this wasn't the right day. The promised land was a land flowing with milk and honey. In God's providence, here was a divinely supplied source of honey. In verse 25, the battle moves from the hill country into the forest. There were a lot of ground bees in Israel, and so the soldiers came across some honey in the woods. This group of soldiers saw the honey dripping right in front of their eyes. Yet Saul's foolish oath prevented them from receiving what God put right in front of them. But Jonathan ate the honey, and his eyes were enlightened. Hunger and fatigue affect and dim the sight. But the Israelites said to Saul that Jonathan should not die, since he brought about the great deliverance in Israel. 4. The soldiers of Israel sin because of Saul's foolish command. Verses 31 to 33. The people rushed on the sheep, cattle, and calves, and the people ate them together with the blood. God specifically commanded Israel that they should always properly drain the blood before an animal could be butchered. Deuteronomy 12:23 to 25. On this day of battle, because of Saul's foolish command, the people were so hungry that they broke this command. The troops had chased the Philistines all the way from Michmash to Aijalon, a distance of about 20 miles to the west. It was now evening, which meant the men were released from Saul's oath, and they were so hungry that they ignored God's command not to eat meat with blood in it. Their obedience to Saul's foolish command led them disobey God's clearly declared command. This is always the result of legalism. We often think that legalistic rules will keep people from sin. Actually, the opposite is true. Legalistic rules lead us into sin because they either provoke our rebellion, or they lead us into legalistic pride. 5. Inconsistent behavior of Saul. Verses 33 to 35. Because the people ate meat that had blood in it, he said that the people had broken faith. Saul blamed the people for what was really his own fault. He should have never made such a foolish command, as his command had only provoked the people to sin. Saul set up a stone to properly butcher the animals and also build an altar to the Lord. At least Saul did something right after he had done what was wrong. His real problem here is inconsistency. Saul is not consistent in the way he goes about making decisions. Saul followed his own instincts. As Proverbs 28:26 says, "Those who trust in themselves are fools, but those who walk in wisdom are kept safe." 6. In response to God's silence, Saul makes another foolish oath. He was wavering back and forth on decisions. Verses 36 to 45. But Saul was not only struggling with consistency when it comes to making wise and foolish decisions, he was also having trouble wavering back and forth on decisions. Don't make promises you can't keep. Genesis 2:17, Ecclesiastes 5:2-5. Don't lose your trust with people. 1 Corinthians 4:2. Saul wanted to find the wrongdoer by casting of lots. Lot in the Hebrew is very close to the word Thummim. They probably used the Urim and Thummim as the way to cast the lot. Then Saul prayed to the Lord, the God of Israel, "If the fault is on me or my son Jonathan, respond with Urim. But if the men of Israel are at fault, respond with Thummim." The lot fell on Jonathan. Saul was shaken. He pronounced a death sentence on whoever ate in violation of his forced law. Instead of admitting that the commandment and death sentence was foolish, Saul hardened himself and declared, "As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilt lies on my son Jonathan, he must die." Saul was willing to kill his son rather than humbly admit that he was really at fault. Now, Saul's men issue a counter oath to save Jonathan's life. They are no longer listening to Saul on this matter. Saul, in his foolishness and stubbornness, had lost the trust of his men. Trust is a valuable commodity, and when you are inconsistent in your life, you are going to lose trust of the people. 7. Saul became weary and gave up. Verse 46. Saul and his men had the advantage. They were pressing the enemy, but they didn't finish the job. Saul stopped pursuing the Philistines and they withdrew to their own land. Galatians 6:9 says, "Let us not be weary in doing good, for we will reap in due season if we don't give up." The passage ends with a final reminder that Saul never finished his job with the Philistines. Saul fought against the Philistines all the days of his life. If only he had finished them off when he had the chance, he would have enjoyed peace in his lifetime. So Saul established his sovereignty over Israel. Verses 47 to 52. This last passage in this chapter is all about Saul's strength. He established his sovereignty over Israel. He fought many successful battles. He had a large and influential family. The strength of Saul's army grew. When Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he took him into his service. Saul's strength was broad over many areas but shallow. Because Saul was not a man after God's own heart, his kingdom could not last. Conclusion. Every leader should be able to lead in times of crisis as well as in times of comfort. Crisis and times of uncertainty are inevitable. Consistency is especially important when it comes to leadership. Leaders need to be daring and also keep the trust of their people. Nothing kills a leader's influence more quickly than inconsistency. God is looking for consistency. Be consistent in everything you do. 1 Samuel chapter 14. Questions. 1 Samuel chapter 14. Answers.